I'll also say that nothing that I say here is meant to be prescriptive or suggest that there's only one way to write a novel. I hope you'll take what's useful to you and discard the rest. I think as you see in Refuse to Be Done, that the idea is very much that like this is comes out of a version of my practice and of my own teaching of novel writing in the MFA program. But one of the things I love about teaching novel writing is seeing all the different ways it can be done. And so whatever doesn't sound right for you, you should just discard. And then I'll say we will have questions at the end with Scott, but you are welcome to comment or put questions in the chat as we go. I've taught on Zoom a lot. I'm used to seeing the chat sort of go out of the corner of my eye. And if I see a question there about something I'm talking about, I'll try to answer it as I go as well. You also probably already can tell I talk a little fast. There's a lot of content here. We're going to go kind of quickly. 98% of what I talk about is covered in a different way or some other way in Refuse to Be Done, which you all have or are getting a copy of. And so if we don't go into something in great detail here, know that it's something you can revisit in the book as well. Okay, so the book is divided into these three drafts, which it almost immediately retracts as drafts and calls stages. These three stages of the novel writing process, and we're going to go through them in order today. Each of these, I think, requires like a distinct kind of revision. In the first draft, we're going to talk about what I think of as generative revision, the kind of revision and rewriting and studying your material that helps you write the rest of the book. In the second draft, we're going to talk about narrative revision, which is where we're going to get the story and the plot and the structure into the best possible shape it can be. And then in the third draft, once we're sort of story complete, we're going to talk about polishing revision, where we really make that turn from the writer-based version of the book to the reader-based version that goes out to your first readers or your agent, your editors, or people in that way. So we'll kind of go through these things in order, with the caveat that really some of the tactics in each draft you're doing in other stages as well. So this is a way to organize the material, but it doesn't mean once you're done with part of this, you never have to do it again. Excuse me. So the first draft, which I mentioned is thinking of as generative revision. I think a lot about this quote from Lucy Corrin, which is from an essay of hers called Material, that is in the Tin House Writer's Notebook set of craft essays, which I highly recommend. And in that essay, Corrin says, you should look at the material you produce to find your material. The story is always smarter than you. There will be patterns of theme, image, and idea that are much savvier and more complex than you could have come up with on your own. Become a student of your work in progress. Every aspect of a story has its own story. So we're gonna practice some of that as we talk here, as we move into this first draft, looking at ways that we can look at what we're already making in order to discover what remains to be written. So this first draft, I think of as an exploratory draft. When I'm writing a first draft, I usually begin without an outline. I often don't know very much about the book before I start. Sometimes I've started really with like a piece of language. I've just kind of started writing and written a novel from that. Sometimes I have more of an idea of what I'm doing. But I really, no matter what I start with, I'm discovering the novel by writing it. And in doing so, I become the writer who is able to write the book. I almost always feel like I'm incapable of doing the thing I'm setting out to do as I begin. One of the things that I feel like is very important to remember, especially if the idea of writing a novel feels particularly daunting to you, is that the task of any given day is never to write a novel. That there's really no day where you sit down and do that. That a novel is this accumulation of small efforts combined over time. So we're going to break the novel up into smaller tasks almost throughout this sort of lecture, things that you can get done in a smaller unit of time. And then just again, to sort of make it seem less daunting, not everybody's a write every day kind of writer. We're all writing when it fits into our life. But if you were to write 500 words a day, which is about 2 pages double spaced, 5 days a week for a year, you would write 130,000 words, which is more than enough for a novel draft, right? So like, by making the task small, just to write 2 pages every time you sit down and write, you very quickly accumulate the amount of material that goes into a novel. And then I'll just also say, if you haven't written a novel before and you're setting out to do so, I think reaching the finish line of your first draft is maybe like the most important thing you can do for yourself for your future as a writer. Knowing that you can write a beginning, middle, end gives you confidence for the next draft and for the next book. I think if you like are consistently writing like 2/3 of a novel, that you'll never sort of have that knowledge that you can do it. So we're going to try to focus on how we get through this first draft. I mentioned that I don't normally start with an outline, and for me that's often because I don't know enough to outline the book. I think I simply can't see what the book is until I start writing it. But this year in my novel writing class, I've been talking about other kinds of ways to sort of guide the first process that aren't full outlines. And one of those is the log line, which is something we get from screenwriting. It's usually a single sentence description of the plot of a book. So there's maybe two variations here that I'll sort of give you. As you know, if you could write just this sentence at the beginning of your novel that sort of as you see it right now, this might be a way to help you. This first variation, a single sentence with an ironic twist. The classic example of that is like the movie Die Hard. New York City cop goes to California to visit his family at Christmas time, only to find his wife's work overrun by terrorists, right? The sort of the scenario and then the unexpected thing that happens. And even though you don't have all the plot points of Die Hard there, you know what you're writing into. And then this other variation, which is a single sentence that includes a character, a conflict, and a clock. I like to think of this through Cinderella. Cinderella has to fall in love with the prince by midnight before her rags will turn into, or her clothes will turn into rags, right? So we have a character, a thing that has to happen, and how long it's happening over. If you have those three things, you have a lot of what you need to write a novel. And then this other kind of outline that's not an outline is a question central to the novel that each major character would answer differently. I often discover this question by writing, but you may know it before you begin. Game of Thrones is my usual example here. Who should be king of Westeros is a question that like every person in that novel or show answers differently, and it fuels the plot. The difference between like the Stark's answer and the Lannister answer is like most of the plot of the show, right? So just knowing that shows you how to put characters into conflict with each other. From there, we're ready to begin. We're going to dive into this first draft. I think one of the most important things you can do for yourself right away is to give your novel a working title. I love this Kevin Brockmeyer quote. I think of the title as the target toward which I fire the arrow of the story, that the title tells you what the novel wants to be, or it sort of contains the novel even before you've written it. I see a lot of like novel drafts that are called like novel2.docx. You may have one of those on your hard drive. I think naming your book is a way of sort of loving your book, and it's also a way of imagining it already complete. In my class when I teach novel writing, I make students have titles on the first day so that we can refer to people's books as if they already exist, even though they have barely started writing them. I find that to be really helpful and useful as part of the confidence game of writing a first draft. One of the other things, if we're not outlining, I really love this idea. It comes from a novelist called Charlie Smith. It's what he calls writing the islands, by which he means you write the parts of the book you can see, even if you don't know how they're connected. So that scene, that's like the reason you want to write the book. You can sort of see in your mind this thing that happens. Often we hold off on writing that. We try to write toward it. And Smith sort of suggests that like we should write those things first. We should get them down the page, that those are like the reasons the book wants to exist, and that getting them down makes room for other scenes to sort of come for you. There's also a way of like following your excitement, of being sure that you're writing things you're really excited about, as opposed to like waiting till you get to the good part. I also suggest in this part of the book that you read what you've written predictively, then write what you predict. And what I mean by that is you at some point you'll have 30 pages, 50 pages, 100 pages, and maybe you don't know where to go anymore. But if you go and look at what you've already written and you read over it, you're looking for future actions that have been foreshadowed. You're looking for themes that are being set up that you can pull forward in new scenes. You're looking for character wants that haven't been resolved yet. I practice this on published books to try to teach students to do this. When you finish a chapter of a novel you're reading, just stop and think like, what future scenes does this chapter make necessary? What has to happen in the future of this book because this part has already happened? And sort of strengthening that muscle will let you look at your own books and sort of see what wants to exist in the future. I also do a lot of research in this stage of the novel, but I do very specific kind of research. If I'm reading a book for research, I'm watching a movie, I'm going somewhere, I don't take a lot of notes. I find that the kind of notes I take about nonfiction often stay really inert and they're really hard for me to translate into fiction. So one of my tactics generatively is when I'm reading for research, if I find something that I'm like, oh, I want to put that in the book, I only let myself write it down by writing it into the actual novel. That I use it to write a scene, I use it to write a sentence of description, I put it in dialogue and have a character talk about it. And that way my research is always producing new fiction, as opposed to being like a separate process that I'm doing. That helps me a ton, and it keeps you from doing that thing where you have all this research and no fiction written, which I think is a trap that many of us can fall into. And then I think a lot of these two ideas that are kind of similar versions of each other. First one is from George Saunders, who talked in an interview at Bomb magazine. It's online. If you Google George Saunders and Bomb, you'll find it. Where he talks about your task as a writer is to steer your characters toward the rapids, that they're going down a river. And in real life, we normally try to get ourselves and other people out of trouble. We try not to cause trouble. And Saunders says you need to steer your characters toward the rapids. And there's a similar idea from Charles Baxter in his The Art of the Scene, where he talks about all the things you were yelled at like as a kid, where your parents say like, don't make a scene, or someone says you're making a scene when you had too much to drink or something. Like in fiction, all those things are what cause scenes. Like when a character says, I wish I'd said, or I almost did, or I thought about saying, that those are places to go back and like make them do those things. That the character who says the thing they're not supposed to say makes scenes happen. People who are as polite as we are in real life, trying not to cause trouble wherever we go, do not make for good fictional characters. So we're going to discover our characters as we write them. I love this quote from Claire Watkins that I think is really instructive. Like, this is what we're trying to figure out in the first draft. And Claire says, you need to know the story the characters are telling themselves. And then beyond that, you have to know the story your characters are telling themselves about the stories they tell themselves. That as we're writing about characters, we're paying attention to the way they explain themselves, the way they explain why they act, and also the stories they tell about how they became that person. That's really, to me, like, that's the backstory that you need to know to write characters, is how they became the person they are. You can discover this as you write. You don't have to sort of plan that. We all have a story we tell about ourselves and the way we are and why we're like that. And I think figuring that out for your characters is like the ideal thing you're figuring out at first draft. One of the ways to figure this out is to keep your characters acting and keep your characters making choices. That in every scene, a character should do something, a character should choose something. Even if they don't do something, they should actively choose not to do it. Like, refusal is a choice, right? They're not just like accidentally not doing anything. I think this is especially important in a first-person novel. First-person protagonists often become observers, especially in first drafts. You're discovering the book and the world of the book through that person's eyes. So it's really easy for them to become kind of like a camera, but not do very much. And so looking for ways for your character to act and make choices will make your first drafts more active. When your characters don't act and don't make choices, it doesn't create any like future causality. So it doesn't create like future scenes because there's no sort of cause and effect happening. So we're trying to make that go. When I talk about change, these are some of the things that it might mean. This first list of 4 things comes from Jeff Vandermeer's Wonder Book. Discoveries, complications, reversals, or resolutions are all things that can make it be enough change in a scene. A character doesn't know something and then they learn it. Something they wanted to know, they set out to learn it, and now they learn it. That's a discovery. A character gets close to their goal, but it's more complicated than they think it is. That's a change, like learning that kind of thing. And then the flipping of a binary, which I mean can be really dramatic, like they were alive, now they're dead, they're rich, now they're poor, but it can be quite a bit smaller. It could be they're happy and something happens that makes them sad. It could be that they wanted to ask somebody to marry them and now they have asked someone. You know, that's sort of like looking for those places. If you can find that binary that's changed, that means change has happened. My friend Will Chancellor says when he sits down to write every day, he doesn't let him stop writing the scene he's writing until something changes in it. And I think that's one of like the great rules. I think that's really smart. Inevitably, you will get stuck. First drafts are hard. Middles of first drafts are a nightmare. You will sort of eventually find a place where you hit a block. These are some of these sort of 3 scene practices that are ways to get unstuck. In scenario planning, when you're trying to like imagine what might happen in the future, because of like if you're doing climate change scenario planning or something, one way to do that is to plan for a good outcome, a bad outcome, and a weird outcome as sort of a thought exercise. If you write 3 scenes, one where something good happens to your protagonist, one where something bad happens to your protagonist, one where something weird happens, you will shake up your book. Like new things will be sort of in motion, and that can be a fun way to proceed. And then these other three scenes that I would suggest writing if you get stuck, and these are all about conflict and power to some extent. They're all ways in which characters are using or being affected by power. A scene in which your protagonist does something to someone else, which means they're acting upon them. A scene where your protagonist does something for someone else, which means they act on their behalf. And then a scene in which your protagonist has something done to them, which means they act upon it and then can react to it. If you get stuck somewhere, these three scenes will sort of illustrate a lot of the relationships. You can also see they're all scenes in which two characters are sort of involved. So they get your characters interact with each other instead of wandering around by themselves, which happens a lot in my first drafts. And then, as we're going through this first draft, when I wrote my own first novels, I wrote two novels before my first published one. And one of those novels, my plan was that you would never look back, that novel writing was all about momentum and that you would just write as fast as possible to the end of the book. And that did get a novel draft written, but it made an unreadable book because I had not revised anything in it and things didn't really connect. And I could have vowed never to do that again. Now what I do is every day at the end of my writing session or later in the day, I look back over the manuscript and I just try to find one thing I can fix the next time I sit down so that and it can be really small. It can be like, oh, I saw there was a missing word in this sentence. I just know, like, I'll go fix that sentence when I sit down tomorrow. Sometimes it's like, oh, I need to rewrite the opening to this scene, something more larger scale. And the reason for that is that so every day as I'm finishing, I have a plan for beginning the next day. I have a small task that I can do as soon as I sit down that keeps me from like spending my whole day on Twitter or something waiting to begin. And then I would say like every day retreat a little bit, like go over like the last 3 pages you wrote and just like edit back through them, make changes, reread them. I find I often have almost completely forgotten the day before I was writing, by the time I sit down again. So come back at it, work it fresh. And if you get really stuck, if you really don't know what to do, back up a bigger chunk, go back like 30 pages and edit forward. I think 30 pages is about the most prose most of us can hold in our head, like 30 to 40 pages. So if you back up 30 pages in your manuscript, you'll be coming at it pretty fresh because you will have forgotten a lot of what's in those 30 pages. And then this other maybe like really important thing for the first draft, I love sentences. I love the sound of language. I love writing like the best sentences I can. But in a first draft, I also don't want to fixate to the point of paralysis where I can't write forward because the sentences aren't perfect yet. I know in my process, I'm going to rewrite everything. So writing good sentences is part of the joy of writing, but I'm also going to rewrite them all. So there's sort of, like somewhere in the middle here of that feeling. I find that when I have to make a big plot thing happen in the novel, my sentences like get very bad. Like as soon as I can't do everything at once. I can't write beautiful prose and write dialogue in 3 different characters' voices and make a plot thing happen. And so like learning that like sometimes it's okay to write a sentence I know I'm not ultimately happy with, that's not going to be in the final book, so that I can write forward is really important. You're probably a writer because you care about sentences, and finding your balance on this is important. What I'm really saying there is a way of suspending judgment, which is also what this Jane Smiley quote says. Favorite things about sort of first drafts. And I'll just read this. You don't know what you're writing until it's done. So if a draft is 500 pages long, you have to suspend judgment for months. It takes effort to be good at suspending judgment, to give the images and story priority over your ideas, but you keep casting about for the next sentence. I think there are 2 kinds of sentences in a rough draft: seeds and pebbles. If it's a pebble, it's the next sentence and it sits there. But if it's a seed, it grows into something that becomes an important part of the life of the novel. The problem is you can't know ahead of time whether a sentence will be a seed or a pebble, or how important a seed it's going to be. So we're writing all this prose, we're writing all these scenes, and we're trying to keep from being sort of ultimate judge of the story yet, that we want to sort of privilege what we're writing and make forward progress. And one day we've done it. We celebrate, we feel excited, we've written a first draft. I don't know everybody else's experience. My own experience with my first drafts is that they often make me feel very proud of myself for completing it. And I also feel a little dismayed because I sort of know the thing I've written is not like a publishable book. Like it just is not usually at this stage. And I often think about this Borges story on an exactitude of science. I don't know if anybody knows this. It's a really short, like 2-page story in which a kingdom of cartographers sets out to make a perfect map of the kingdom. And what they end up making is a one-to-one map of the kingdom. So it's the same size as the kingdom, which is of course not very useful. And I think a lot of times with my first draft as that like one-to-one size map of the book. It's like a book-shaped object that is not the book. So I think I sort of recognize that over time now. And I'll say like this is a good time to take a break, make something else, do something else, put a little art and live time between this draft and your sort of going forward. I'd say like for me usually like at least a month. But it's a good time to like write a short story, write an essay, work on some poetry, do something sort of like that's not the novel, so you can come back to it fresh in the second draft. Which I think is exactly this Hilary Mantel quote, where she says, "I have to take a deep breath before I start the first full revision. I used to hate myself for procrastinating, but now I see it might be wise. You need to pause in holy fear at what you've done and make sure you don't wreck it in panic." So we finished the first draft, and now we will pause in holy fear while I take a drink of water, and we will begin the second draft. So I mentioned that this is what I think of as narrative revision. And what I do at this stage is I reverse outline or map the first draft. So I look at what I've done and I create a narrative outline or a beat sheet outlining the first draft to analyze what I've made. So I didn't have that kind of plan for the first draft, but now I'm going to make it from the exploratory first draft. And what I want to outline here is the action that occurs during the time narrated, which is like the main plank of time in the story. So not backstory, not digressions, not like a future frame from which the story is told, but just the action that occurs during the time narrated. Trying to do beats of time moving forward, so events. And what we're trying to do here is to study what Jim Shepard calls the rate of revelation, which is the sense we have at the pace at which we're learning crucial information about the story's central figures. This rate of revelation is like the effect that makes us feel like we're learning new things and discovering as we go through a novel. If you're writing something like science fiction or fantasy, where you have like a lot of world building, there's a similar rate of revelation to that, like the way we learn about the world over time in the novel is part of that. Once I have this outline written, then I study and revise the outline to plan the second draft. So I'm analyzing the shape of the novel's plot as it's expressed in the structure. What's missing, what takes too long to happen. For example, one of the things, if you're writing something that's in a third act structure, the first act of a third act structure ends usually when a character stops reacting to the inciting incident of the novel and starts acting. They take charge of driving the plot. This is a moment I'm looking for in this outline. It's often a little missing in a first draft, or it's a little fuzzy. The hero of your story has to like choose to act. That's what makes them the protagonist of the book. I think about this through Lord of the Rings. If Frodo just kind of like wanders around with the ring and just ends up in Mordor, like that's not particularly heroic, but like he chooses to take the ring there. That makes him like the protagonist of the story. So you're looking for this moment where your character chooses to be the protagonist of the story. Most novels are driven by causality, which each scene made necessary by the one before it. So you're studying the cause and effect chain of your novel. What happens in scene 1 that makes scene 2 necessary? What happens in scene 2 that makes scene 3 necessary? We're sort of looking for those choices and actions that we had in the first draft. Related in every scene, what changes? I love this quote from Robert McKee. This is from his book Story, which is a screenwriting text that's really good on plot. He says, "A story must not retreat to actions of lesser quality or magnitude, but move progressively forward to a final action beyond which the audience cannot imagine another." So we're trying to make this outline into a book where that happens. And then I'll say that you should remember that the outline is a scale model. It's our little map of the kingdom. And the reason we make it this way is because it's easier to move things in the outline than it is to move them in a novel. Moving a chapter in your novel is really messy and complicated. Moving a bullet point in your novel should be really easy. So this is a place to be brave and sort of try out new things and be kind of bold in the way you approach your story. This process takes me more time every time I do it. I think the last time for my novel Appleseed, which is really complicated, it has like a 3-part structure. I spent like months on this part of the process. I spent quite a bit of time, but usually a couple weeks. I do spend quite a bit here. I'm going to put a whole bunch of stuff in this slide, and I'm not going to talk about it. It's going to be super overwhelming. Feel free to take a screenshot of it. And I also have a newsletter at mattbell.substack.com where I describe everything that's here. So you can also go and look that up afterwards. But one of the things that I've started teaching and doing is when you make that outline to map it against some kind of existing novel structure, something that lets you sort of see the missing parts. That if you take something like the 3-act structure that most movies use, that you'll be able to sort of plot your book against it and see how it works. Again, there's a really, like I wrote a long essay about this for the newsletter, which it's free and you can find, and I'd suggest looking at that. Angela asked if we received these slides. I believe you receive like a time limited private link to the video, so you can watch this again. And most of this is also in the book in sort of more detail as well. Thank you, Angela. I love, Emmer says, Causality reminds me of Gonzalez's consequence idea of what drives the novel. Characters making choices, create consequences, create more choices. That's perfect. I love that. Thank you, Emmer. So we have a revised outline. We're ready to begin our second draft. And here I use the revised outline to rewrite the novel, that it's a plan for the new novel. And for me, I really mean write your novel. This second draft is the one that usually feels like a real book to me. Like as I'm writing this, I'm writing linearly now. I don't usually go on until I sort of have each scene working pretty well. And when I finish this draft, I often feel like very excited. This is the one where I'm like, I've done it. What I do is I retype the book from scratch, writing the better book I outlined and planned from the first draft. I do not throw away the first draft. I use the first draft as a guide, stealing whatever I can from it, but I always retype. I don't allow myself to cut and paste, because cutting and pasting is not revision. You will cut and paste bad prose. You will not retype it or rewrite it. If you're a person who handwrites your first drafts, you're already doing some of this work, right? But if you're a person who types like I do, this is the place where I do that. And what we're aiming for here is this thing Amy Tan's describing here. She says, only when I finish the book can I go back to the beginning and write in the voice of all that happened. So in that exploratory first draft, we're discovering what happened. And the second draft, we're writing in the voice of all that happened. We're writing sort of knowing what's happening in the book. I have never just put my first draft in a drawer and started over. I know writers who do that. I will say every novel I use less of the first draft. So maybe I'm moving toward like one day being the kind of person who just puts the first draft in a drawer, but I've not yet sort of arrived there. One of the reasons is my prose keeps getting better as I'm writing the second draft. And eventually the first draft prose is just not usable. The real reason I do this is because the prose gets so much better at this stage of the project. So this is sort of the first guiding principle of the book, which is when in doubt, rewrite instead of revising. I think it's very, very hard to tinker a bad scene into a good scene. It's often better to rewrite it, sort of knowing what you need it to do, and write it from scratch and get to sort of a stronger place with it. So at some point, we have once again finished another draft. For me, I have found the second draft takes almost exactly the amount of time the first draft does. If it takes me 10 months to write a first draft, second draft takes me 10 months. Over and over, they're sort of about the same amount of work. But one day I finish it, take another break, make something else. This is the earliest I would suggest like having someone else read the book. But I hold on to my work a lot longer than other people do. You know for yourself sort of what you need for feedback. But I even here tend to sort of hold back. This is where we get to the sort of refuse to be done idea, which is the book at this point is plot complete, the story works, it's readable, and now we want to make it the best it can possibly be. We're going to polish the draft and make everything sort of shine. What I'm going to advocate for here is a layered approach to the third draft, which the idea of like taking your novel and like make it good is too daunting, right? It's just too big of a task. So we're going to do all these smaller tasks that can be done. You can do them a chapter at a time, going all the way through a chapter, or you can take them all the way through the book. The refuse to be done when you get the book has like tons of activities for this stage. I'm just going to talk about a couple of the things here because I want to leave time for questions. One of the things at this stage I do is I start doing a pass where I just edit the dialogue in the book. I edit anywhere dialogue appears. Dialogue is my, I think, real like Achilles heel as a writer. I think I'm learning all the time to be a better dialogue writer, but I think it is my weakness. So I do a pass where I just go through and edit all the dialogue scenes. And one of the things I'm looking for here is the balance of direct versus indirect versus summarized dialogue. You know, there's a lot of things you might do here, but one of the things really is that anything that needs to be dramatic, anything that is sort of meant to sort of bear emotion, I think often has to go in direct. Anything that's related to conflict goes in direct dialogue, and things that are more informational can go in indirect and summarize. This is one of the ways we make dialogue scenes more dynamic and that we compress them. So I'm looking at that. I'm thinking about how all fictional conversation is competition. Even if we're just like telling a joke, we're trying to get the other person to do something, which is to laugh, right? So like every conversation is sort of want based. We want people to think we're smart or sexy or funny or whatever it is, or to do something for us. So we're looking in conversation how dynamic it can be. Where does the balance of power control shift as the conversation continues? We've all been in a conversation where we're sort of holding the floor and someone else takes it, right? That's a place where the balance of conversation changes. I look at all the actions around the dialogue. I write tons of like sighs, smiles, shrugs, winks, nods. And when I was a student, this was famously where all of the smoking went in a novel, right? Sort of like everybody was smoking around the dialogue. And I go back and I try to take as much of this out and put like better, more revealing sort of action in to make it more specific. This is something I would do mainly only at this phase. So replacing with stronger action. As you're cutting stuff from your book, as you're replacing things, you have that diminishing first draft. Sometimes I can find actions in that. It's one of the things that my cut file can be really good for. Sort of abandoned scenes are full of interesting actions that can sometimes be brought back in. So beginning to end, work the dialogue. You inevitably edit around the dialogue too, but this is a way to sort of progress through the draft. This is also when I really, really work in my prose style. I've always been trying to write the best sentences I could, and now I'm going to try to ensure this. One of my favorite things is I'll go through the whole book, maybe a chapter at a time, and I will look at every verb in every sentence, and I will try to replace sort of mundane or obvious verbs with more precise or interesting ones. There's an example in the book from Ben Percy's Red Moon, where he has writes great verbs, but talking about instead of like a security guard looking at a ID with a flashlight, he spotlights it, right? Like looking for some way to put a more interesting verb in place. And what I find is when you put a great verb in a sentence, you can often delete whole clauses or other sentences around it that are all describing the bad verb. Like, like the verb is good enough, it'll do a lot of work. I diminished thought tags. I thought, I understood, I knew, I figured out. In the kind of close third person most contemporary writers write, or of course in the first person, most thoughts don't need to be tagged. They are sort of obviously thoughts if they're well written. I'll try to get all that kind of out of the prose. And we'll look for these looking and hearing verbs: looked, watched, saw, heard, any of the century verbs, but these are the more common ones. Something like taste works a little differently. Instead of saying like she looked at the car, just describe the car, right? We sort of know the characters are the ones looking at it. So we can, instead of saying I heard the gunshot, describe the gunshot. So sort of looking for those places. You can almost always get rid of that and put a stronger image in place. And then, what really makes style go is varying sentence and paragraph lengths and constructions. You probably have a default kind of sentence you like. I've never met a sentence I didn't want to make longer. You can probably hear that when I'm talking. In my first novel, I think there's one sentence in the whole book that doesn't have a comma in it, right? And that's a weakness of that book, even though like I tried really hard to write good prose. It's variety that makes sentences feel or style feel dynamic. And I think you're looking for ways to break out of that. There's this book by Virginia Tufte called Artful Sentences, Syntax as Style that I sort of just always champion. It's like an encyclopedia of sentence types, of ways sentences can be built. I sort of suggest this book for like everyone to own a copy of. And it's really, really useful in this way. And then one of the things that I really love is this sort of three-part tactic here, where I print out the draft, or you can certainly do this in like a PDF on a tablet or something too, anything that lets you highlight. And then I go through the draft and I highlight for a couple different things. In the interest of time, I'm just going to talk about the last one here, but this is all in the book as well, which is I go through the draft and in every paragraph, I highlight the weakest sentence. If it's a short paragraph, maybe the weakest clause. And then I go back and I just delete all of those paragraph by paragraph. And sometimes you have to write something else back into its place, in which I try to write a new sentence instead of tinkering the bad sentence into something good. My novel Appleseed is 500 pages long. In the final version of it had 2,500 paragraphs. So at some point I went through and I took out the 2,500 weakest sentences in the novel. You can both imagine how daunting of a task that was, but also the effect of it, which is like the book's shorter and the weakest 10% of it came out, I just did this with a short story where when I did this phase, I took 1,000 words of the short story when I thought I could not possibly edit it anymore. And without taking out any actions or any events, the story just got better and tighter. I can't recommend that sort of step enough. It's amazing how much cleaner it leaves your book. at some point we're cutting what we can, we're getting rid of things that don't need to be there. And I would just say that often feels very daunting. But I think, as Chris often says, I've cut thousands of pages from my work, but those cut pages were necessary to the final draft. To me, the final product is like an iceberg. You only see 10% of the actual work, but the other 90% is still there. All the stuff you're cutting is still sort of sensed by the reader in what remains. And I think that's very exciting and useful. So you're not getting rid of things, you're sort of taking out some of the scaffolding that's holding up your book, and the reader just needs to see the final product. We are running out of time, and I want to make sure I leave time for questions. So this is all in the book too. I'm going to end with this last thing from Pam Houston, which is called "Pull Up Your Widows." And Pam wrote this in an essay. You can find it online. If you look up "Widows," Pam Houston, you'll find it. It's also in the book. And if you know what widows and orphans are in typesetting, they're like the two or three words at like the end of a paragraph that are on their own line. So your Word document is not how your book's going to look, right? It's arbitrary. But one of the very, very last things I do with the book is I go through and I try to get rid of those 2 or 3 hanging words in every paragraph in the book. Try to make every paragraph end at the right margin. And the reason for that is that like when you think you could not possibly edit the prose one more time, you go and you find 2 or 3 words you can get rid of in every paragraph. And you know, really what you're doing is just putting a little pressure on the prose. Sometimes I mean getting rid of a clause by putting in 1 good word that can do the work of 5 words or something, you know. It's this very, very late way that's completely arbitrary of like editing the prose one more time and you think you can't possibly do it. I get so much done of this. In my second novel, I took like 8,000 words out of the book just doing this at the end, like this wild, I've been working on the book for 3 years, I couldn't possibly edit it again, and then found all these ways to like tighten the prose to do this. With my last book, I changed the font after I did it, and then I did it again, which is maybe obsessive and crazy, and was also really great. So these are just some of the things that I'm doing in this very, very late stage to make it the best it possibly can. And then the last thing I do before I send the book out, before I send it to my agent, before I send it to readers, is I read the book aloud, cover to cover, myself. And the reason I do that is partly, of course, you find a couple things to fix. But at this point, it's very, very hard for you to read your book on the screen. I just know it is. And what this allows you to do is give yourself the experience of the final book or the near final book, the book that's going to go out. And you get to have it before you give it to anybody else, one more experience beginning to end of the thing you've made. It's a way for it to be celebratory. It's a way for you to feel it in your body, for you to get to have contact with the best possible version of your book that you can make. And I think that's really important to do, sort of a gift you can give yourself for the effort you put into the book. I'm going to stop there. So we take questions. I'll just leave this here for a second if people want to screenshot this, if you'd like to stay in touch. I do write this craft newsletter. It's free, it comes out once a month. Every month has kind of an essay on some part of writing craft and an exercise. And if you want to stay in touch with me there on social media, I would love it. Thanks, Kara. I appreciate it. And I'd love to sort of have you with me there. Okay, I'm going to take this down and I'll let Scott come back and we will chat with you all. Thank you all so much. I know that was just like a ton of stuff very quick. You have the slow version in the book, I promise.
Yeah, thank you so much, Matt. You know, like I said, it is really amazing to see so much of this content, you know, that we learned at the ASU program, you know, available, you know, through the book. And so, you know, I remember way before I applied to ASU a number of years ago, I know you would post a lot of kind of like creative writing, kind of like advice through Facebook as well. You know, you have the Substack newsletter now with this book coming out. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about where that kind of like motivation comes from, the energy to kind of like connect with other writers and to develop kinds of forms of craft.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, some of it's just when I started writing, I was, you know, a college dropout living in rural Michigan, you know, writing short stories in my parents' basement. I did not have a writing community, and I craved one and needed one, and really found my first ones, you know, online. And so that sort of sharing with other people online has always been sort of part of my practice, partly because it's also me like reaching out and being like, please talk to me about these things. And I think one of the things you find is like if you share the things you're interested in, you share the things you're learning, people share back, you know, and you get to have those discussions about it. Like hoarding your craft knowledge does not do a lot for you. And I think when I first started writing, have teachers who like wouldn't share things with me, you know, like I remember asking my first creative writing workshop teacher for like, can I see like a cover letter that you used to submit to magazines? And he was like, no. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, it was like such a weird, it's like sort of, I'm like, I don't know. If the only way you can compete with your students is not to help them, something's wrong, right? And so I feel like we all just help each other, and we sort of, share what we know, and then everybody sort of is in this environment of teaching each other. That feels much more practical for me. Yeah, sort of hiding your influences or hiding what you know feels kind of small to me, and just would make me feel crazy all the time. It's much easier to sort of give it away.
Right. Yeah. So my wife Stephanie is the photographer, and when we really started talking a lot about art and stuff, she was like, "Man, she was like, writers are so open with their processes.
Mm-hmm.
She's like, visual artists like don't want to share their secrets about like
Right.
how a particular photograph was made or a particular painting technique or things like that." So she was very impressed with just like writers being very kind of like communicative about how to achieve certain things.
Yeah.
Um,
I delete my syllabi off my university's website so they can't own it, and then I'll give it to anybody who asks, right? It's just like
right.
totally different thing. Like in community, happy to give it to you, but maybe not to let it be right. There's like a time and a place, right? Yeah. You see Angela being like, right.
Right. And then one question I just wanted to ask as well before we jump over to audience questions is, I know reading is such a big part of your practice. I know you mentioned it a lot in the book as well. I'm wondering if there's ways that you can almost kind of like give some advice of how we can continue to develop as readers, how to kind of like grow our own reading practices, and kind of why that's valuable for the work that we do.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing I've really learned from other writers is that the people who seem like the most unique writers have the widest like influence base. The writers who in my life are like, oh, like no one really writes like that person. And then you talk to them and you realize they're reading, not only like current books, in English, but they're reading translate literature, and they're reading outside of their genre, and they're reading philosophy and science, and they're reading books that were published 50 years ago, and they have some kind of foundation in classics, and they're sort of reading outside of their own identity and their own sort of lived experience, and that sort of wide influence gets synthesized into something really unique seeming. And so I think that's part of it. Teaching has made me read even more widely because my students come from so many different backgrounds and come from so many different goals, and I want to be sort of responsive to them. One of the things that I do for myself that I think is very, very easy to do is I keep two commonplace books, although mine are like Word docs. And in one of them, I copy out passages of books I'm reading that I like. I read a sentence I like, I read a paragraph I like, I just type it out and copy it into that document. And I have another one for like craft quotes. I read something in an interview, I read something in a book. My craft quote Word doc is like 100,000 words long. It's like 15 years of like pasting like little snippets of like, oh, I like this thing Scott said about dialogue or something, right? And it's kind of wild sometimes when you're teaching and just being like, I just need something about this. And then you have it, and you kind of go back through that, or I feel stuck. I go back through that document and I get reminded of ideas that have inspired me in the past. And I find that really helpful. So keeping that kind of document can help you retain your reading, I think, in a way that's really valuable.
Cool. Yeah, the quote from the book that I love so much is the bigger you make your art life, and this is where you're talking about reading widely, the more possibilities your imagination will generate. And so I love that kind of like taking in to produce out. And so yeah, that's great.
It's funny, even though you told me it was from the book, I immediately was like, who said that? That's good. I'm gonna go write that down in my commonplace book.
Yeah. Great. So I'm going to jump over to questions from the audience. So Angela, if you're ready, yeah, go ahead.
Hi. I'm really interested in the fact that you don't read aloud until you get to the third draft.
Oh, I read aloud constantly. Yeah. That's just like a thing where I'm doing it end to end. Yeah, but sorry. Yeah.
I'm a storyteller and a musician. So when I describe myself as a writer, it's writer by rote.
Yeah.
So I don't usually write down until I've been telling the story for a while. And I just wanted to tell one time I went to a play workshop and we wrote for 45 minutes, and then we were taking turns reading, and I got to the part I was reading what I had written that was a script, but then I could feel this other thing happening, which was the spontaneous telling. And so I was pretending I was reading, and I was not reading.
Right.
I was telling.
Yeah.
But that was something that I noticed. But I'm putting in chat the Now Storytelling Network. We are this is a real organization, but it's like the best kept secret in the United
Nice.
States.
Thank you.
So I want to put that in so that you all can look at it. There's local regional groups that meet where people can raise their hand and tell.
Oh,
So
nice.
either in person or on Zoom. And there's tons of stuff happening on Zoom. So I just wanted to extend that resource to you all if you want to go somewhere and tell a piece of your book. Some of the groups have rules where you're not allowed to read.
Yeah.
So you have to be, you would have to it's a great practice, I
Yeah,
think.
that's very cool,
But
Angela. Thank you so
so
much.
anyway, I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank
thank
you.
you, Angela.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. Che, yeah, go ahead with your question.
Hello.
Hi, Jay.
So, hello. First off, thank you so much. This was incredibly helpful, and I'm really excited for your book.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you have any suggestions on finding a new place to start. I am 2 drafts in on a novel. I just got some really good feedback to cut the whole first section, and I just have no clue where another good starting point would be. So if you have any suggestions on choosing a new beginning, that would be wonderful.
Oh yeah, yeah, beginnings are hard, right? I mean, it's all hard. I think one of the things I think that the beginning of a novel is often doing is like showing like why the character needs story to happen. You're seeing like the sort of status quo of their life. They're stuck somewhere in some way, and story is going to take them out of that. One of the examples I always use is like rom-coms. My wife and I watch a lot of rom-coms, and one of my favorite like tropes in that is at the beginning of a rom-com, you have to show why the person needs to fall in love. That's the thing the beginning of a rom-com has to show. So you see like like Hallmark movie rom-com where like a woman is in the big city and she's too busy for love, right? And we see her at her like crushing job and we're like, oh, this person needs to move to a small town and run a bakery and fall in love. And so that I think every novel beginning does some version of that, that you show the person's life, which is static in some way, that they're it's stable, but it's in need of disruption. That and so you're building that sort of ground upon that is not like the ideal for this person, and you show why they need story to happen to them, and then it does. The beginning of Star Wars, like Luke Skywalker is like bored and wants to go off and be a space pilot, right? You see him like he's chafing at his life that he has, and then something happens that lets him out of it. You're trying to make that scenario that creates the sort of opportunity for change for the character.
Great, and yeah, like Yara is saying in the chat, we have time for probably one more question. So if anyone else has a question, feel free to raise your hand. And
yeah, Emerson.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, when you talk about analyzing plot shape, just if you have any advice for further resources to kind of keep thinking about it.
Yeah, I think I wish there was like a really good like literary fiction plot book, and I don't think it quite exists. But I think screenwriting books are really where I've gone to really study that. I mentioned Robert McKee's Story. I'll mention Blake Snyder's Save the Cat. They both they're really good like sort of plot analyses. Save the Cat is like ultra formulaic. It's almost like, I mean, I actually find the tone of the book a little off-putting. But just because it's like, this is the only way to do it if you want to make $1 million in Hollywood. But I find the formula is like a useful way. Like if I plot my book against it, I see like pace things, right? Or I see things where like things are misproportioned, or maybe a kind of turn that's missing. I really learned that like turn out of the first act from screenwriting, which I think is really, really valuable. A lot of like, especially literary fiction novels, have protagonists that just kind of like wander into their story. And it's one of the reasons they don't feel sort of action driven. It's just because the character is not choosing their thing. And so I think that can be useful. Trying to think there's something else. You may already know like Jane Allison's Meander, Spiral, Explode is sort of like the opposite kind of thing, right? So sort of alternative plot structures. I think Matthew Salisa's Craft of the Real World does a good job with some, alternative sort of plot structures to that sort of Freytag or 3-act. But I think screenwriting books are really the place I've learned it. Maybe I'll just say like one of my favorite things in Save the Cat is this part of the beginning of second act he calls fun and games, which is he says the fun and games part of the script is the stuff you see in a movie trailer. Like every movie trailer is better than the movie. He's like the fun and games part always comes from this like first part of second act. And I always think like when I'm writing out my outline, I'm like, where's the fun and games part? You know, like the story's afoot, the characters are into it, and now you're getting to see like the fun implications of like the plot you've got going. I think that's a fun part to like outline. Is like yeah, the sort of like the joyous part of like why it's fun to be reading this book in that place.
Thank you.
So nice to see you. I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Emrys. And I just wanted to close out with Stephanie's question. And I think this is a really great question, because I know for me, being in the MFA program, having 3 dedicated years to only reading and writing,
Yeah.
not being in the MFA program, working, doing stuff, you know, the kind of like opportunity to write every day is gotta really fight for it. But so Stephanie's question is, what recommendation do you have for jumping back into revisions after a few months away from the story?
Yeah, I'm doing that right now myself, because I've been doing events for this book and putting it out instead of working on my novel. So I'm right there with you. And I'll say, like, you know, it's a good time to print out a couple of chapters, go through them by hand. I think sitting down on the computer is really hard to get back into the computer for draft. Like, you open up that file. The longer I've been away from my novel, the more I'm sure the novel is bad. Like, I get this, like, you know, like not looking at it makes me feel like I don't like it a certain way. Printing it out, do some edits, type those edits in, it'll get you back into it. You come back to it kind of fresh. I did that with the first chapters of the novel I'm writing now, and I haven't seen those in a long time because I'm way later in the draft. And it was kind of great just to edit the beginning again and sort of remember what was there, and it made me feel kind of excited about it. I edited maybe 50 pages of prose, and now I'm back out running, in the mornings. I can feel my brain working on the novel while I'm running, and I'm like, oh, I'm back in it. Like, I think that just like, sometimes I don't even end up typing in the changes. This stage, the real thing is just to get me like back in the book, more than anything else. But I think that if you can print it out, carry it around, get yourself back in contact with it. I think it's very hard to open a draft you haven't looked at in 2 months and like write that day in Word. That seems like a very hard re-entry point. At least it is for me. So yeah, find like another way to do it. To read aloud again is a way to like let yourself stay with it. You can't just abandon your reading aloud. Read a chapter aloud, sort of hear it and stay in it that way. Edit your favorite part of the book, not the part you think needs the most work, right? So that you remember why you love the book. I feel like that's like a really important part of that too. You have to fall back in love with wanting to work on the book. So you can find a way to do that. That helps a lot. Thank you all so much for having me today. It's really a pleasure to get to talk to you all. And I know I sent like a million things at you, but I hope you'll have the recording, you'll have the book, and hopefully we'll be in touch outside of this well. And thanks so much to Scott and ER for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Scott. Yes, so folks, you'll be getting an email via the email that you signed up with Eventbrite, with the link to an unlisted YouTube page, which we'll just leave it up so that you can return to it. Just don't blast it out. It's for your use alone, and your book is on its way to you. If you chose local pickup, it is available for pickup now. So come by the store and pick it up. We'd love for you to dig right in. Scott, thank you so much always for all your work in our literary communities near and far. And Matt, thank you for real for your generosity. I love your Substack. I know so many folks who are with us today love it, and I love this book. I've been hyping it to everyone I know who is stuck right now, and it really is a gift to so many people. So yeah, thanks so much. I hope that everyone stays safe and well, and until next time, take care. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.